Welcome, everyone. We'll give a moment for folks to join the call. Welcome, folks. We'll just give another minute for people to join in. Okay, it's 3:01 here on the East Coast, and I think we will begin our webinar today. Again, welcome, everyone. My name is Joy O'Nash. I'm with ERG, a contractor supporting the work of the West Coast Climate and Materials Management Forum, and I will be moderating today's webinar titled Food Purchasing and Climate Impacts. Before we begin today's webinar and introduce our speakers, I'd like to briefly go over some housekeeping details. For closed captioning of today's discussion, please select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your screen. All participants are in listen-only mode. Now, please email nellsolomon@erg.com if you experience any technical difficulties with Zoom. Also, we will be having a question and answer session at the end of our presentations, so please go ahead and submit questions for discussion into the Q&A feature on your Zoom bar. Today's session will be recorded and shared at a later date through the forum website, which is www.westcoastclimateforum.com. Before we get started, I'd like to note a disclaimer on behalf of the forum. Today's webinar is designed to help food purchasing and climate policy experts and practitioners share information about food purchasing, including tools and example policies and projects. We have invited speakers to share their views on topics that connect climate to materials to get participants thinking and talking about new strategies for achieving our environmental goals. Mention of any trade names or commercial products does not constitute endorsement or recommendation for use. Please note the opinions, ideas, or data presented by speakers do not represent forum members' policy or constitute endorsement by the forum. Today's webinar will consist of presentations from our speakers, followed by our moderated questions from you, the audience. And again, you can submit those questions using the Q&A feature on your Zoom control panel. Okay, let's get started. Today, we'll begin with the forum setting the context on government purchasing of food and related climate impacts, followed by real-world examples shared by the Center for Good Food Purchasing, the City of Seattle, and New York City. Today's speakers, we will be hearing from Karen Cook with Alameda County GSA, Colleen McKinney with the Center for Good Food Purchasing, Chris Iberly with the City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and Environment, and Tia Schwab from the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy. We will begin with Karen.
Thank you, Joy. It's a pleasure to be here in my day job at Alameda County. I get to work on green building and green purchasing work. But here today, I am representing the forum as a member of the leadership team, and I'll be introducing some of the work that the forum's done on food over the years. So without further ado, oops. I want to just introduce you to the forum, formerly the West Coast Climate and Materials Management Forum, but we call it the forum for short. It was started in 2008, and it is a collaboration of state, local, and tribal governments working to establish sustainable materials management practices. Materials management is an approach to using and reusing resources most efficiently and sustainably throughout their life cycle, which you can see illustrated here. It seeks to minimize materials used and all associated environmental impacts, especially climate impacts. The forum's mission is to inspire, inform, and illustrate how communities can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions by improving the way they source, use, and recover materials. And we at the forum are fond of pointing out that more than 40% of US greenhouse gas emissions result from the production, transportation, use, and disposal of material goods, which includes food. So I want to start by talking about how we get to this, as it lays the foundation for all of the forum's work. So I'm sure you recognize this graphic, as the measurement of greenhouse gas emissions has become an essential and required task for public institutions. And normally, greenhouse gas emissions are measured by economic sector, as shown here. What we see from this methodology is that the emissions from power generation and smokestacks and the tailpipe emissions are the major sources of greenhouse gas for the US. Most reporting protocols require this kind of accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're looking at the scope 1 emissions, which are the equipment and facilities owned and or operated by an organization, and the scope 2, which are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from purchased electricity consumed by an organization. But where are the materials in this chart? Are the emissions from materials really represented fully in that 2% slice at the top when the materials become waste? Well, it turns out that the full greenhouse gas emission impact of materials are spread throughout every category in this chart. This makes it very difficult to understand the environmental implications of our material consumption patterns. So EPA decided to take another look at how they categorize these emissions and found some surprising conclusions. The next slide will show the exact same emissions, but it will be categorized differently. You'll notice in this chart that the provision of goods and food contribute 42% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. Now we can see the materials. You'll see that the transportation of people and energy used in our building still contribute about half of the nation's emissions, but the significance of our material consumption dramatically changes from one chart to another. Let's break this pie chart down a little further to understand how material consumption impacts climate change. Here's the same chart, but the provision of goods and food, the 42% of the pie that are materials, are broken down into stages of the material's life cycle when emissions occur. So we see that about 33% of the nation's emissions are a direct result of producing the materials we all use, which includes everything from mining raw materials to manufacturing the final product. 7% is from shipping them to consumers, and only 2% is the result of disposal. So it's pretty clear that the production of materials is where the vast majority of impacts occur over a material's life cycle. So if we want to reduce the impacts of material consumption and really focus on materials management, this is the chart we should be using to guide our actions. So this begs the question, where are we focusing our efforts today? So this simple chart shows the life cycle of a product. All products follow this life cycle of resource extraction, processing, manufacturing, distribution, use, and final recovery or disposal. Traditionally, programs focus on waste management at the end of a product's life cycle, which is represented by the small circle in the graphic. End-of-life management could include recycling, burning for energy recovery, composting, and landfill disposal. However, materials management looks at the full life cycle of a product, and it is what we call the upstream parts of the life cycle, the consumption and use, and even more so the production part of the life cycle, with resource extraction that is by far the biggest impact on greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts as well. So with this primer on the forum's thinking and emphasis on materials management, I want to turn our attention to the work the forum's done on food waste. So the Food Too Good to Waste toolkit was developed by the forum over a decade ago now, and it aims to reduce wasteful household food management practices. It uses the concept of community-based social marketing principles to encourage households to keep food out of the landfill and more money in their pockets. It includes an implementation guide to teach local governments and community organizations how to implement a campaign in their community. The forum developed this tool, and it was piloted by communities across 10 states between 2012 and 2014. And after that, the EPA adapted and published the toolkit, Food Too Good to Waste Toolkit, in around 2016. And so the toolkit now lives on a national platform and is available to communities. Another useful tool for organizations is the Climate Friendly Purchasing Toolkit. This toolkit was developed to help public institutions and others target their purchasing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Research shows that the supply chain, or the production of goods and services that we purchase as organizations, account for 35 to 55% of greenhouse gas emissions associated with government operations. This toolkit aims to reduce the carbon footprint from institutional purchasing by identifying the most carbon-intensive products and services and providing how-to guides for reducing those impacts. The toolkit includes a trends analysis, which helps identify the most carbon-intensive products, which the toolkit then addresses in sector-specific strategies. It provides guidance for public institutions, academia, and other entities on specific purchasing strategies to help reduce the organization's carbon footprint, and allows organizations to connect their purchasing to their climate plan and to use the purchasing power to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I want to thank you for allowing me to set the table on the forum's work on food. Please be in touch with the forum if you'd like to learn more about our work, and I will now pass it on to Colleen McKinney. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Colleen McKinney, and I'm the Director of Engagement at the Center for Good Food Purchasing. I'm joining you today from the Seattle area. I've been working on our Good Food Purchasing program since it was developed in Los Angeles in 2012, and have been lucky enough to have had a chance to collaborate with each of the municipalities that are represented on this panel in various ways over the last decade. So it's great to be here. The Center for Good Food Purchasing is a national nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in the Bay Area of California, with staff, program participants, and other partners located all across the country. The Good Food Purchasing Program, which is our primary program, offers a holistic framework for prioritizing social and environmental values through food purchasing decision-making. I want to talk a little bit to start about the importance of food and why we're focused on food as a lever for change. Food has been identified by many bodies, including the Eat Lancet Commission, which is comprised of field-leading researchers in human health, agriculture, political science, and environmental sustainability, as one of the most high-impact ways to address human health, climate, and sustainability. Additionally, the institutional food service in the US results in $120 billion in food spending, which is a huge opportunity to shift the market in ways that have direct outcomes for environment and human health, especially if we're moving in the same direction intentionally. The price of food does not reflect the true cost of producing food. So notably, a third of greenhouse gas emissions stem from the food system, and nearly $2 trillion in healthcare costs are spent on treating preventable metabolic diseases in the US. Beyond this, many of the lowest paid jobs in the country are in the food system, with many of these workers living in extreme poverty, particularly farm workers and their families. Overall, there are $2 in health and sustainability costs for every $1 spent on food purchasing in the US. And these impacts are felt inequitably, with the greatest impacts on food chain workers, small and mid-sized family farms, and communities of color and other historically underinvested communities. With all of this in mind, the Center for Good Food Purchasing, our mission is to use the power of procurement to create a transparent and equitable food system that prioritizes health and well-being for people, animals, and the environment. And we do this through the nationally networked adoption and implementation of the Good Food Purchasing Program by primarily major large public food purchasing institutions. So we work with these agencies to support them in understanding how their purchases align with our good food values and shift toward greater alignment with the values over time, and to unify efforts across cities, regions, and sectors in order to really create that large-scale demand that can signal the desire for food produced in ways that reflect our values. So a foundational feature of the Good Food Purchasing Program is the commitment by institutions to equally prioritize 5 good food purchasing values, which are shown on this slide, along with the principles of equity, accountability, and transparency. Using the framework of the Good Food Purchasing Program and its singular focus on institutional food purchasing as a lever for change, communities can simultaneously advance strategies that are essential to any climate change reduction or mitigation strategy, including decarbonization, sustainability, such as improved soil health and decreased chemical fertilizers and pesticides, resilience to weather-related catastrophes and greater supply chain diversity, and human and animal welfare, including improved rural economies, better working conditions for food workers, decreased food-related diseases, and improvement of animal welfare. So in our program, some of the most common climate metrics, including carbon and water footprint and sustainable food purchases, are measured and communicated as environmental sustainability metrics. However, we know that labor and animal welfare advocates are crucial allies in addressing the climate crisis via food. In particular, farm workers are called on to work in increasingly dangerous heat conditions without adequate protections, and animal production is the greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the food system, while impacting nearly 10 billion animals per year. So by ensuring that everyone who's impacted by the food system and the climate crisis sees their priorities represented in this framework, we believe we have the greatest potential to work in coalition and collaboration to address the power structures that are driving the market toward the lowest possible price and not taking into account the impacts to human lives and livelihoods, community health, animal suffering, and immense environmental and climate impacts. So the Good Food Purchasing Program is the framework that we believe can build the power that's needed to make food systems work for everybody who's impacted by the current food system. Here you can see many of our national partners listed, which represent issue area constituencies like sustainability, labor, and animal welfare, sectors like hospitals, school districts, colleges, and universities, academic and advocacy-based research organizations, and organizing and movement communications groups. These partners and more are key advisors in the expansion and implementation of the Good Food Purchasing Program. Additionally, we collaborate with local partners in cities where we're working to support the effective implementation of the Good Food Purchasing Program in the local context. So we're often working with organizations like food policy councils, good food purchasing coalitions, or other grassroots organizations that include representation from most impacted communities, as well as city government offices of food policy and public health. Priority setting in each city where we work is really guided by these partners, and we offer our support through the Good Food Purchasing Program to help the partners that are involved on the ground measure their progress and communicate the successes and lessons that they've learned along the way to the constituencies that matter to them. So the Good Food Purchasing Program has grown steadily since we started in Los Angeles, and were adopted in LA public agencies in 2012. We became a national initiative in 2015 and have grown to work in 27 cities and counties, and in 16 states and Washington, D.C. In total, we're working with over 70 institutions, which includes school districts, hospitals and universities, municipal agencies for parks, aging, homeless services, emergency feeding, juvenile detention, and jails, among others. And in total, the Good Food Purchasing Framework is impacting over $1.1 billion in annual food purchasing across the country. There are numerous commitments and programs that municipalities have adopted to pledge their commitment to more climate-friendly diets and food sourcing. A few of the key ones are shown here on this slide, including the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, the C40 City Food System Signatory Cities, and the Cool Food Pledge. And the nice thing about the Good Food Purchasing Program is that it aligns really well with many of the Sustainable Development Goals as they relate to food systems and can be a tool for implementation and measurement of progress toward these goals for US cities and counties. Our job at the Center for Good Food Purchasing is specifically to support institutions in meeting their commitments to the good food values. What this looks like is when we start working with new institutions at a city or county, we do individual evaluations of each food service operation to show where their food dollars are going and how their current food purchases and products that they're purchasing align with the good food values through what we call a baseline assessment or baseline report. Then we assist the agencies, ideally with support from a local coalition and folks with regional supply chain expertise, in setting goals and incorporating values commitments into formal policies and food bids and contracts. Then every year or two, we measure progress toward meeting their goals and celebrate success, uplifting individual leaders and agencies that are taking critical steps toward increasing good food purchasing over time. The last thing I want to share is a little bit about our Impact Hub. So to support municipalities in understanding and communicating the impacts of their good food purchasing commitments, we developed an Impact Hub, which includes impact calculators in 3 key areas, including climate and sustainability, community health, and local jobs and wages. And anyone who wants to communicate the impact or the potential impact of good food purchasing efforts in their city or county or region can use the calculator to enter their food budget, the strategy that they're interested in implementing and that's appropriate for their political context or their operations, including reduction of certain types of products, or as well as pesticide reductions, not shown on the slide, but there's a calculator for the impact of switching to organic production or organic products to reduce pesticide usage overall. And then you can see the output in terms of impact. The Impact Hub also includes information about each of the good food values, the principles of equity, accountability, and case studies that highlight work that's happening in 8 cities around the country. We've also used the Impact Hub in action in the Bay Area, where we've been able to show collective impact of 9 agencies who are implementing across 3 different jurisdictions in the region to show the impact that they've been able to have collectively. So it allows for collaboration across a specific jurisdiction as well. So the agencies, those 9 agencies came together for learning and planning as a region, and having the impacts, information about the potential impacts of their work helped them to set aligned goals that move the region in the same direction, communicate a unified approach to suppliers, vendors, and distributors, and that can benefit the individual institutions when they're communicating with their contracted suppliers and vendors, drafting bids, and communicating performance around their climate goals to their respective governing bodies. Finally, we also work on policy as co-founders of the Federal Good Food Purchasing Coalition. As part of this coalition, we're leading on efforts to ensure the federal government is leveraging its incredible purchasing power toward the good food values as well. So the coalition published a report in 2023 analyzing the potential impact if the federal government utilized its food purchasing power to decrease its carbon impact, since the federal government purchases much of its food through the USDA. And those impacts, those decisions impact like what's actually available to school districts, early child care centers, and other locally operated programs. The federal government's food procurement decisions really matter to cities, counties, and other local level jurisdictions. So this has been an important area of work for us as well. With that, that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions in the chat or after other panelists have wrapped up. And I will now turn it to Chris Iberly of the City of Seattle.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everyone, for having me. My name is Chris Iberly. I'm a food policy and program strategic advisor at the City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and Environment. I'm going to talk a bit about the values-based food purchasing efforts we have underway. I'll say we're a little earlier on in expanding some of this work, especially compared to friends like New York City, and you'll hear from Tia speak to some of those after me, but especially for municipalities or city governments looking at maybe starting in this work, some of this might be useful to hear about our approach so far. I wanted to start by saying a large part of my role is actually working on our Healthy Food in Schools partnership. That is with Seattle Public Schools, supported by Seattle Sweetened Beverage Tax. We work on supporting Seattle Public Schools efforts to provide more fresh, culturally relevant, scratch-cooked meals and a fresh fruit and vegetable snack program, including some sustainable, equitable food purchasing and values-based food purchasing support. Is one way that we've been working on this is within our Healthy Food in Schools partnership, and there's a few other city food programs that focus on values-based food purchasing also. So we know there's a lot of opportunity. So kind of building on that foundation of some of the values-based food purchasing that happens in City of Seattle food programs already, we're looking at expanding our work on values-based institutional food purchasing. In short, trying to transform our food procurement through various city food programs to purchase more foods and from suppliers that align with core values that we're working on defining and refining even this year. And that means shifting away sometimes from suppliers that are contributing to climate change, environmental injustice or degradation, social and racial inequities, unfair wages, et cetera. So there's definitely an economic aspect to this too, and a lot of other values that we're looking at similar to good food purchasing program, including and beyond environmental sustainability and climate impacts. Just the economic investment in our local economy is an important piece. You can see here some of just a breakdown of the institutional food purchasing that happens on an annual basis in King County, where Seattle is significant. But definitely coming at this from a climate and greenhouse gas emission reduction perspective too, knowing that based on consumption-based greenhouse gas emission inventory that Seattle Public Utilities and OSC worked on, 24% of Seattle's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions come from food, the majority of which is from eating outside the home, right, in institutions that are buying and serving food in our communities. So a lot of this work actually stems from the Food Action Plan update process that is a plan that's forthcoming this year, but has been in development since just before COVID and really picked up again in 2021. Did a lot of engagement with community leaders in food systems and food justice throughout Seattle during 2022 and 2023. And this is just a preview of some of the actions that came out of it that are really looking at and encouraging and supporting the city to focus on food purchasing, procurement in ways that support access to culturally relevant local foods, supporting BIPOC-owned food business, Black, Indigenous, people of color owned food businesses, tribal enterprises, just strengthening food value chain coordination, again, across city staff that work on food procurement and purchasing in different programs, and looking at future ways to expand sustainable and equitable food purchasing throughout Seattle. So some of the things we're doing this year, we're started to convene a subgroup that is made up of city staff in different departments, coming out of the Food Action Plan organizing that was also across multiple departments in the city. Began meeting in 2023 to provide a space for staff that work on food procurement for city programs, especially through contracting and subcontracting, to start to develop best practices. How do we approach more sustainable, equitable, values-aligned food purchases within those programs, maybe through sharing best practices, developing toolkits to help apply a framework of core values. And that was another thing that city staff team worked on and is still working on, the developing a draft of a core values framework, which is 6 values that I'll give you a quick summary of. And we're working on developing and refining a second draft of those values through kind of the second piece of the initiative this year is developing the framework, which includes definitions, criteria, through workshopping a draft with community leaders that are outside the city but work intensively on food systems, food sovereignty, and food justice. And then also engaging with partners and contractors that work with us on city food programs to get feedback on the framework's definitions and criteria and what they would need to implement it, right? How can we support these shifts in food purchasing? Again, coming back to the opportunities, just within the City of Seattle team that works on food purchasing, some of the programs that that we're focused on include, food and meal programs, food banks, senior meal programs. Fresh Bucks is another program that provides a benefit to consumers, particularly low and middle income consumers, to access fresh foods. But also potential partnerships with other institutions in the Seattle area with a lot of purchasing power. So, taking all together, that adds up to around $47 million that could be aligned and reinvested in values-aligned food purchasing, just in some of the relationships and partnerships we're working on. So these are the 6 core values that actually came out of the Food Action Plan engagement and development that we heard from community, that they want to see city food programming and just institutional food purchasing in general reflect. So racial equity, environmental sustainability, local economy, fair labor practices, health and nutrition, and cultural relevance. Definitely standing on the shoulders of giants here with Center for Good Food Purchasing and national initiatives and frameworks that we're using as a foundation in developing, what a lot of these things mean and what the definitions and criteria would be for foods and food items and products and producers that would meet or align with one or more of these values. Just diving into the environmental sustainability piece, again, we're I think it skipped the, okay. The goal here is to then take those 6 values and look at how they can be applied in the procurement process, and whether that's through goal setting and program design, measuring the actual impacts at the end of the day with different programs, but also developing RFPs, criteria and specifications, proposal templates, how solicitations are reviewed and awarded, and how we can use those procurement tools to shift to more values-aligned food purchasing within the procurement process. Just diving into the environmental sustainability piece, knowing that, we're talking a lot about food and climate impacts today. The draft definition so far, still in development, still subject to change, is looking at foods that are produced using practices that are meeting, one or more of these definitions: regenerative, building soil health, improving biodiversity, improved grazing if it is a meat item, agroforestry, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, items that are organic or seasonal or plant-based, foods that prevent food and packaging waste, and reducing water use. And then lastly, looking ahead, just a lot of great opportunities we're excited about. Starting to develop a partnership with University of Washington Dining that is already focused a lot on local food purchasing, but ways that we can support their efforts with more values-based food procurement across all those 6 values, along with a proposal we submitted to the EPA climate pollution reduction grants that, if awarded, would also support, particularly focusing on foods and menu changes and supporting vendors that provide sustainable regenerative food items to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, working with, again, more institutions in the Seattle area. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Tia.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Tia Schwab. I'm a policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy. And we are tasked with providing strategic and policy advisement to the New York City Mayor, as well as Mayor Adams' leadership on all issues related to food. So as you can see here, that intersects with things like food security, healthy food consumption, and economic environmental sustainability across the food system. In 2021, the Mayor's Office of Food Policy developed Food Forward, which is our 10-year policy plan to improve our food system in New York City. And it's organized around 5 overarching goals, which you can see here. intersecting work streams like economic opportunity, infrastructure, public health, sustainability, and governance. Today, I'll be focusing on Goal 4, the environmental sustainability piece. So just creating a little bit of background for this conversation, research tells us that the agri-food system must be central in our work for a healthy climate. Depending on methodologies, estimates range from 10 to 50% on how what percentage of greenhouse gas emissions the agri-food system is responsible for, but most center in around that 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions being attributable to the agri-food system. And electricity and transportation are the other large sources. However, even if we phased fossil fuels out completely, we would not remain below 2 degrees Celsius of global warming if we did not make changes to our food system. So just to really distill it down, this IPES Foods report, ignoring the 1/3 of greenhouse gases emitted by food systems is not an option if we want to achieve our climate goals. As I mentioned, a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions from our food system stem from large-scale global industrial meat production and the deforestation required to raise animals and their feed. So in the United States, and we see similar trends in New York City from our consumption-based emissions inventory, animal-sourced foods account for about 82% of diet-related greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're looking at our diets, reducing our consumption of high carbon foods like beef and lamb and increasing our consumption of plant-based foods can reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. Another high impact tool to reduce food-related emissions includes reducing food loss and waste along the supply chain, which several other panelists mentioned. And then, of course, there are other elements of environmental sustainability, not just greenhouse gas emissions, such as air quality, water quality, and soil health. And New York City works with partners in the region to monetarily support sustainable management practices to protect the watershed, for example. And we also work with partners to ensure small and mid-sized producers in the region have support for best management practices and have access to supply chains in New York City. However, today I'll be focusing on the greenhouse gas element of environmental sustainability and how dietary shifts are the most effective tool we have to reduce emissions. So reflecting this, Department of Health in New York City recently launched a campaign, Eat a Whole Lot More Plants, to encourage New Yorkers to adopt a balanced diet full of whole plant foods. And this just reflects the fact that higher percentage of whole plant foods in our diet is not just has health benefits, but also environmental benefits. So this is the more consumer-facing side of that work. And then we also want to make sure that as a city, we are buying and serving food that supports our health and climate goals. And that's where the New York City Good Food Purchasing Initiative comes in. So each year, New York City agencies spend about $500 million buying food and meals to serve to New Yorkers, and that's in a variety of settings. So that's school meals, hospitals, detention facilities, older adult centers, shelters, food pantries, and more. And the goal of the initiative is to support agencies in aligning their food spend with 6 key values: local economies, environmental sustainability, nutrition, animal welfare, a valued workforce, and transparency. And this looks familiar because this initiative was inspired by the Center for Good Food Purchasing's program that Colleen discussed. They've been helpful partners in adapting this framework to the New York City legal and administrative context and identifying metrics for each of those values that really work in our local context. So for each of those values that I just mentioned, we have a metric that we're tracking progress on, and our goal is to see measurable improvements year over year. So each year we collect data from the agencies on what food they're buying, and then we analyze it and upload it to our public dashboard, and then see how it's aligning against these different values. So for transparency, we're looking for how much data was complete enough that we collected from our vendors to analyze. Did it have origin information, weight, et cetera? For local economies, we want to increase the amount of food we are purchasing from New York State vendors, as well as minority and women-owned business vendors in the city and the state. Environmental sustainability, we're seeking to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions of our food purchases by 33% by 2030. Nutrition category, we're analyzing our food purchases and how much the menus at each of the agencies are in compliance with the New York City food standards, which are our nutrition guidelines. Animal welfare, we're tracking the weight of animal products purchased each year. And our valued workforce, each agency, when they are going to enter into contract with vendors, do something called a responsible bidder evaluation, where they look at the vendor's history and current status and ensure that they're adhering to all local, state, and federal labor laws. We obviously know that the food system is rife with labor violations. So as a city, we're exploring what more can we do to really ensure that the supply chain before our vendors, we have visibility into that, and we can increase support for a valued workforce in those steps of the supply chain that come before our vendors. So this category is definitely an ongoing work in progress. Oh. So yes, as I mentioned, we post all of our data on the Good Food Purchasing Initiative dashboard. This is just a snapshot from the most recently available year's data, fiscal year 22. So as you can see, we're focusing a lot of our work on increasing the minority and women-owned business spend, as well as continually reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So for environmental sustainability, like I mentioned, our goal is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Our lever here, one of the most powerful levers we have, is to buy fewer animal products and more plant foods, just because of the information I outlined before. So just between fiscal years 2019 and 2023, we've seen a 22% reduction in per plate emissions. So we're definitely on track. But there's always more work to be done. And we look at per plate emissions just because the amount of meals served each year vary a lot, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we recover to those pre-pandemic meal counts, we're looking at how much emissions we have per plate for the food purchased. So we've learned quite a few things from our work to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions by purchasing more plant, whole foods, and less animal products. First, this work benefits from behavioral nudges and food education. We're supporting across not just the public school system, but other agencies with events and support like tastings, food education sessions. We have a food education roadmap that was released last year to incorporate education around this issue in every public school student's journey in New York City public schools. So we definitely know that not just providing the food is not just enough to encourage people to make those swaps. And I'll just move forward for a slide. So in the hospitals, for example, we have the plant-based default program. So the first option that's presented to hospital patients is always plant forward, and they can request the alternate menu item if they want, but the first kind of default item is plant-based, and we see about 50% of patients sticking with that. So again, that's an example of these behavioral nudges and education that we're pairing with our purchasing changes. It also, purchasing different food also requires collaboration between the menu planning, culinary, and procurement teams. So as we buy fewer animal products and more plant-forward whole foods, we are asking our culinary teams to cook different meals, prepare food differently. So this has required an investment in the culinary workforce. And we really want to support across all of our agencies, the culinary teams, with having the skills and resources to prepare delicious plant-based meals, because we know if we are just changing the food that we buy, but the food prepared is not delicious and clients aren't eating it, then we're really failing to achieve the health and climate goals that we set out to achieve. So just skip ahead here. In our school system, we have a partnership with a community organization called Wellness in the School, where a council of celebrity chefs developed 100 plant-based scratch cooked, culturally relevant recipes, and those were tested across all 5 boroughs. And the ones that received student approval are now being rolled out in school districts via culinary training for all of the cooks across the school system. And similarly, in our correctional facilities and our juvenile detention facilities, we recently got a grant from the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, where all culinary staff at these 2 agencies will be receiving hands-on culinary training in plant-forward cooking. So again, this menu development culinary piece really has to happen alongside our purchasing changes to support our climate work. That's all from me. Thank you so much, and I will turn it back to the host.
Thank you so much, Tia, and everybody for your presentations today. Much appreciated. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we'll move to the Q&A portion of our meeting today. There are a few that have come in, so I will just read the questions off for folks. If the presenters would all like to come on camera, that would be great. Let's see, I'll start with one for Colleen. Colleen, can you tell us more about the role of federal purchasing? If I heard correctly, you said that federal choices influence what is made available to daycare centers, school districts, etc. Did I hear that correctly? And can you please explain further?
Yes. There is the USDA Commodity Foods Program and a couple of other federal programs that are available to school districts and others using federal meal programs like early child care centers to purchase foods that are purchased by the federal government and then available to school food authorities locally. And so those decisions that are made at the federal government level impact the choices that are available then for the local school food authorities.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Chris. Your estimate of $47 million available for values-based purchasing included $5 million at Seattle Public Schools. With an enrollment around 50,000, that comes out to $100 per student year, which seems low. Is $5 million the entire budget for food at Seattle Public Schools, or just the portion of it that SPS could direct or redirect? And if that's the case, why can't SPS direct all of its food budget? Or is that a federal government USDA limitation?
Oh yeah, good question. Relates to the other one too. So that's the $5 million is an estimate of the annual food purchasing budget that Seattle Public Schools uses to buy ingredients, which is a portion of the federal reimbursable amount that schools receive when they serve a meal that meets the National School Lunch Program requirements. So that's why there is, I don't know the number off the top of my head per meal right now. I think it's around $3.28. I don't know if any of my other panelists know for sure, but I can look it up. But that's per meal that has to cover labor and meal ingredients. So that's where that $5 million estimate, and that was just an estimate, comes from, as far as the amount of funds they use to buy ingredients throughout the school year.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Tia. How difficult or easy has it been to collect data to do the calculations on how you've reduced CO2 per plate from 2019? Could you talk through how you are doing that?
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, we collect purchasing data from the vendors, and then we actually work with partners at the World Resources Institute through the Cool Food Pledge, who sort that purchasing data by food type and then analyze the greenhouse gas emissions over the years. So we use the WRI methodology in short, and to the other point of the question about how easy it is to collect the data, it's definitely an ongoing challenge. So I mentioned that transparency is one of our values, and how we track that is the completeness of the data we collect each year. For some of our agencies, the agencies themselves buy the products directly through contract directs, and we have higher percentage of data completeness there because we hold the contracts with the language around the requirement to supply that data. But we have a lot of agencies, for example, homeless services and New York City Department for the Aging, that has decentralized meal programs. So they, have multiple different shelters or older adult centers, and they're all serving different menus, and they're run by human service providers that contract with the city, but then they subcontract out the food component. So the further away that the kind of food contract that we hold gets from New York City, it's a little bit harder to oversee the passing on of that data collection requirement at the end of the contract. That's something that we're always working on, but definitely one of the largest challenges we face with the good food purchasing program. If you check out our dashboard, we have 100% data collection for some agencies and very low percentage for others.
Thanks, Tia. The next one is for you as well. This participant would love to cite some of your findings and results. For example, your 36% reduction in per plate emissions at city hospitals. Are there some reports or a website you could point us to?
Yeah, I can definitely drop that article in the chat. So that's data collected from the purchasing data at health and hospitals. So they analyze their greenhouse gas emissions before and after implementing the greenhouse gas or the plant powered default program, if you're referring to the 36% number. For the reductions citywide, that's also on our dashboard. The really cool thing about the dashboard is you can download all of the data behind it, so that directly from our website. And again, if you're interested in the WRI methodology, that's also linked on WRI's website. You can download the cool food calculator that they use to calculate those emissions.
Great, thanks. Okay, here's a question that perhaps all of our panelists could respond to. How has cost factored into the good food procurement decisions? Have you found that the costs tend to be higher, or was it mixed or offset, such as plant-based diets being less expensive than an omnivore one? We're curious if any of the panelists have gotten pushback on this good food purchasing policy because of limited budgets, and if so, how it was overcome. Let's see, Chris, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, this budget impacts definitely been a discussion, like I said, across our like multiple city food programs and staff within them. And really some have larger budgets or more flexible or ability to absorb if it's a higher cost item, even though it's more values aligned, and others have less flexibility with that, you know, just to be honest. So definitely something that we are looking closely at. How do we work around that? How do we support strategies that staff or partners and contractors can use to, you know, be budget neutral if they have to be, and balance it out with other, you know, food costs or program costs. And yeah, so definitely looking at how it might impact budgets and what the cost is. And at the same time, especially talking with Seattle Public Schools and some other institutions, it's not always more expensive. Just depends on the item, depends on the vendor. Sometimes buying food more locally or from a values aligned producer rather than a large scale supply chain can be more affordable and not cost as much. And so that's another strategy, right, to try to incorporate.
Thanks, Chris. Colleen, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was just looking for a link to a resource that we developed that supports the answer to this question from our perspective. I think, you know, a lot of the points that Chris hit on are right on. Like, there are certainly products that meet good food values that are more expensive or come with a price premium, but there are also a variety of strategies that municipalities that we're working with are using to find products that are like within their current distribution systems, or that they may not even know about, that are aligned with good food values, because there is a company that has a union contract with their employees that sort of helps them to meet the valued workforce category of the program, and that's a product they're already purchasing. And then a lot of like operational menu management kind of strategies as well, in terms of some of what Tia was describing, in terms of shifting from like sort of products that incorporate more plant-based foods. And so if I can pull up the resource, I'll drop it in. But in short, yeah, I think that there's a lot of strategies that municipalities are using to directly address this tension point. So that they can sort of do the work in the short term with where the market is and the price points where they are.
Thanks. And Colleen, if you find the link after the webinar, just send it to me and I'll put it in the follow-up email so people receive it along with the recording. Tia, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think they definitely both said exactly what I was going to say. I think the strength of values-based purchasing is that you can balance costs with those other factors. We've seen that as agencies move to more whole unprocessed plant foods, that is cheaper than animal products. And like Chris said, buying from New York State can be more cost effective than buying from a larger distribution chain. And also, if you swap an animal product for a plant-powered product, you could buy, for example, maybe a plant, you could buy a bean that was USDA organic certified, for example, because that's still going to be cheaper than the chicken. So I think the plant swaps have allowed us to buy a higher quality of both animal products and plant products by just reducing the overall purchases of the animal products. Like I said, moving in that scratch cooking whole foods direction does require an investment in culinary training too. So that is a cost, but hopefully in the long term, that really invests in our workforce as well.
Thanks. There's actually a follow-up question here for you, Tia, with regards to a previous answer on the WRI food, Cool Food Pledge. Is the WRI calculator denominated in dollars or mass? That is, do you report dollars spent on different foods or quantities by weight of different foods?
Quantity, we report both the price or both the dollars spent and the weight of each product. So when we collect from the vendor, we can analyze the breakdown of like how much money is being spent in different food types, but also the weight of that food. I'm not sure if that's answering the question, but the greenhouse gas emissions are calculated by weight.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, another participant would like to hear from all the panelists about marketing plant-forward food to your constituents or partners or stakeholders, what works best, and what is a common pushback. You want to start, Colleen?
I think that the other two might have more specifics to provide on the answer to this question. I can pull up a sort of general resource, but I'd love to hear from them first.
Okay, Chris, you want to go?
How about Tia goes first?
Tia.
I think New York
just
has
dropped
more experience in that. Yeah.
I just dropped the more information about the WRI methodology in the chat as well, so you can really see how they break down food type by weight and things. But in terms of how we market more like the public facing work of purchasing, I think that points to the food education and campaigns that I mentioned. We know from our work in public schools that presenting people with different food isn't enough if it's not delicious, appetizing, if it also isn't paired with information about why we're buying and preparing different food. So with our food education roadmap, I think a lot of that is messaging in terms of the why behind what we're doing. And then also that more broad New Yorker facing campaign, Eat a Whole Lot More Plants, I think, to talk about how it can often have dual impacts of environmental benefits, health benefits, and also monetary benefits in terms of budget savings. So I think there's a lot of reasons that people come to think about, there are a lot of reasons people buy the food that they do. And if we present people with different avenues to really connect with good food purchasing, whether it's from an animal welfare perspective or a nutrition perspective or environmental sustainability perspective or buying local, I think that's what makes it powerful, as people can connect with different pieces of the messaging.
Did Chris or Colleen like to add anything now that Tia's gone?
I just added a link I'll drop in the link to our good food purchasing standards as well, but within that there are a number of implementation appendices, which include resources that different partners that we work with have developed for many of the common implementation components. And one of those is a resource of some plant-based marketing. So this is not a specific answer, but just a direct for other available resources from organizations like Friends of the Earth and Chef Ann Foundation with recipes and things like that as well. So,
Chris, did you want to add anything?
I'll just add within the food action plan update process, I mean, you know, educating and community-led education too about marketing around food choices and just the impacts of people's and institutional food choices is something that is a hope for the future. And I think a lot of it, some of the things that have come up is, you know, focusing more on the what are the positive choices that can be made rather than, you know, being too negative or critical of individuals' food choices in particular, knowing that we want to be empowering and supportive, especially around the issue of cultural relevance, and knowing that, you know, different cultures and backgrounds and the foods that are important and really critical and core to different cultures may or may not align with a fully plant-based diet, right? And so I think that's definitely a discussion that we're having too, in assessing like how do we do some of that marketing and education.
Great, thanks. There's actually, Chris, you had made some follow-up comments in the Q&A or some additional notes about the budget items in the Seattle Public Schools. Did you want to follow up with that verbally?
I can people see that in the Q&A? Sorry, I lost track of.
I think we can. I'm not sure that the rest of the attendees
Oh,
can.
okay. Sorry, I gave a clarification to David's earlier question around the food budget at SPS and how it breaks out for the number of students that are eating school lunch. So only around 13,700 students actually participate in the school lunch program. So that works out to more like $360 per student for ingredients throughout the school year. But that doesn't include the USDA Foods Commodity Program that Colleen mentioned, where schools get often an average of 20 to 30% of their ingredients through that program too, which isn't an out-of-pocket cost that they pay for in the same way. So yeah, just to unpack a little bit of the kind of web and tapestry of ways that school food budgets work.
Thank you. Thanks for elaborating on that. Okay, we are at the hour, but we are prepared to stay on for a little bit more. So there's at least one other question. Hopefully we can get to, if others come in, we can get to those as well. So let's see, the next one is sort of from the other direction. Do you all have any advice for where not to start a program and what food service or residential segments are the most difficult to make progress with?
I think I can, if I'm understanding the question correctly about which what parts of values-based purchasing can be more challenging to start with. I think the procurement law landscape in New York City has informed a lot of where we started with our values-based purchasing work. We have some tools at our disposal, for example, price preference for New York State products and price preference for minority or women-owned business enterprises that really allow us to make progress in those areas of values-based purchasing. Right now, we have less tools available in terms of the animal welfare and valued workforce areas. Like I mentioned, we can't currently preference or require third-party certification. So unless it's a government program like USD Organic, you can't really put a third-party certification into preferences or points. So I think for us, that's kind of informed where we started with changing the types of foods we put on our shopping list, so to say, rather than differences between the same food item, like just different versions of that. I also think that that has helped us from a more of a budgetary perspective. So I think procurement law would be like the procurement law context of your municipality would be my answer.
Chris or Colleen, want to add to that?
Yeah, I think like hearing other case studies or different cities and communities, how they've approached this, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a way you could categorize, you know, just hospitals or just prisons or just corporate campuses as easier or harder. Often it just depends who's there doing the work, who are the chefs, who are the decision makers, and any of those can be places that can make a lot of progress or be challenging depending on who's in those decision making positions. I think ironically, or maybe not ironically, but the the National School Lunch Program and just school food in general, I think, is one of there's so many constraints and parameters, budget and reimbursement rates just being one, but school kitchens and scratch cooking capacity and a lot of the other things that schools have kind of constraints around, supporting school food workers as well. Makes it difficult, but is also one of the most impactful places because you're feeding kids good food. And so it is the reason I think there's so much support, whether from Center for Good Food Purchasing, the broader Farm to School movement and National Farm to School Network to help. There's so much help out there, from USDA and from so many other entities, nationally, state level, locally, in so many places to help make that change and do more good food and values-based food purchasing at school districts, because it is hard. I mean, there's no avoiding that, but it's important, and definitely often a place to start because there are actually starting points that might be easier than some of the other sectors, I think, in some ways.
Thanks. Colleen, did you want to add anything from your perspective?
I don't think so. I think what Chris and Tia both shared is a really excellent summary. So
Great, thanks. Okay, this next one is a long question. Bear with me. The focus on plant-based is about shifting consumption between categories of foods, but what about shifting consumption within a single category of food? For example, buying from a rancher that claims to produce lower carbon beef, you're able to consider producer-specific attributes as you gauge compliance with other values, such as worker conditions, which are farm-specific, but assessing producer-specific environmental impacts is much more difficult. Is anybody trying to develop this field, or is it too difficult, and would you recommend against it?
I can say this kind of goes to what I was just saying before, where we have leaned more into switching between rather within. I think one of the difficulties, it's definitely of interest in New York City in terms of what other metrics could we look at of environmental sustainability, besides greenhouse gas emissions, like air quality, water quality, soil health, for example. I think specifically around certain things like regenerative agriculture, for example, there's not yet a unified definition for what that is. And so it's really difficult to kind of put that into a bid and make that assessment within a bid, again, when you can't also preference any third-party certifications. So I think it's just not the easiest tool initially from a public food procurement perspective, but I definitely think it's of interest, and hopefully as the policy landscape shifts, we'll be able to make those kind of within food determinations. And I think often, but not always, of course, you can get at those within food shifts by putting other things into the minimum requirements of the bid. Often, for example, supporting smaller or more local businesses, you have more visibility into the supply chain and to get that information from the producer. But again, it's just definitely more nuanced given there's not a agreed upon definition or certification program for a lot of things around soil health or air or water quality. Chris, did you want to add, or Colleen, sorry.
I think the summary that you gave was really good. And I think that this is not directly answering the question, but one of the things that we are interested in continuing to test in a few places where there's interest and capacity to do so is just locally led verification of on-farm practices, to be able to incorporate non-certified producers that might align with the good food values in one or more of the ways that are embedded within our framework, based on just community knowledge of those producers. So I think just getting at some of the the challenges with third-party certification specifically for doing this work and being able to make shifts to other producers when there are a variety of reasons that producers might not be certified. So that's not an exact answer to your question, but just to build on what Tia was saying a little bit.
Yeah, I love this question, and I think it's a yes and approach. I love yes and approaches. So yes, just from a carbon footprint perspective, shifting from animal products to a plant-based product has a large greenhouse gas emission reduction impact. And if we're still going to have meat being bought and consumed, a better meat, regenerative meat, and there are practices, get down to the certification issue or formal definition issue, that's still emerging and still in development, but there are a lot of practices that reduce the carbon footprint, but have other positive environmental impacts that are agroecological, regenerative, and everything else. So I think there is that, there's, yes, and there's the other, shifting within the meat product category, opportunities for, improved environmental impacts, greenhouse gas reductions. But again, as Tia mentioned, it does you have to start going farm by farm to look at, what are those practices? What's the actual quantifiable, especially greenhouse gas emission reduction impact? So that does make it a little challenging, but definitely hopeful to see that area continue to grow and research continue to support it.
I feel like you've all sort of touched on this. Sorry, Tia, in a sec. You've all sort of touched on this in your answers, and it feels analogous to the current environmental product declarations that are being developed for building materials right now. And wondering if if there's sort of a movement afoot to move in that direction.
I'm admittedly not familiar with environmental product declarations personally, so I don't think I can answer this one.
Well, I'll give it a second analogy.
Okay.
The analogy for the EPDs or environmental product declarations, that they're somewhat like a nutrition label for a package of concrete or a wrap of wood that identifies what the greenhouse gas emissions or what the embodied carbon footprint is of that product. And EPA is currently developing those product declarations and assisting manufacturers to help produce those with regards to data collection from the individual manufacturers, just analogous again to your discussion of having to investigate individual farm practices to develop those labels. Seems like you all touched on it without perhaps knowing that you were.
No, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that would be amazing. And I think as we gradually move to hopefully a world where we have greater supply chain transparency, something like that will be even more doable in the food system context.
Right.
Yeah, love that. More transparency, but that's definitely the missing piece. I mean, I've heard people talk about blockchain or AI or technology to try to, establish more of that for food and supply chains in particular, but not sure there's an analogy, like a parallel yet.
Right. Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to end our conversation there. Thank you again so much for our presenters and panelists today for participating, and also for the rest of you on the call for your listening in and submitting great questions. We will notify anyone who registered for this webinar when the recording has been posted, so you'll be able to review it or view it for the first time. And again, of course, please visit our other resources at www.westcoastclimateforum.com. And we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Take care, everyone.